In supermarkets across the world, brightly colored bottles line the refrigerator shelves. Orange Fanta, Grape Fanta, Strawberry Fanta, cheerful drinks promising sweetness and refreshment. Children reach for them. Parents add them to shopping carts without a second thought. The packaging radiates fun, the carbonation tickles throats, and the flavors deliver exactly what they promise. Nothing about these bottles suggests darkness. Nothing hints at their origins. Yet every sip connects to a story most consumers never encounter, a tale of corporate survival in the heart of Nazi Germany, where innovation emerged not from inspiration but from desperation, where a beverage was born in the machinery of genocide, and where moral compromises made during humanity's darkest hour transformed into a $3 billion global brand that continues thriving 8 decades later. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if these history tales fascinate you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The story begins not in 1941, when Fanta first appeared, but decades earlier, in a Georgia pharmacist's laboratory where a very different kind of innovation was taking shape. 1886, Atlanta, Georgia. John Pemberton, a pharmacist seeking relief from morphine addiction developed during the Civil War, experiments with coca leaves and cola nuts, mixing them with sugar syrup and carbonated water. He creates a dark, sweet beverage he names Coca-Cola. The drink finds modest success at soda fountains throughout the American South. Pemberton never witnesses the empire his formula will become. He dies in 1888, 2 years after the invention, selling his recipe for pittances to various partners who fail to grasp its potential. Enter Asa Candler, a businessman with sharper instincts than Pemberton's earlier partners possessed. By 1891, Candler has consolidated ownership of the Coca-Cola formula, paying less than $2,000 for complete control. What he understands, what Pemberton never fully appreciated, is that the product itself matters less than the system of distribution. Coca-Cola's advantage isn't its taste. Dozens of similar cola drinks circulate through American soda fountains. Its advantage will be ubiquity. Candler begins franchising bottling rights, creating a network of independent bottlers who invest their own capital in facilities, trucks, and distribution channels, but follow Coca-Cola's strict formula and quality standards. By 1900, Coca-Cola bottles appear in every American state. By 1910, the company operates in Canada, Cuba, and Panama. By 1920, Coca-Cola has established beachheads in Europe. The European expansion strategy follows a proven American model. Identify ambitious local businessmen willing to invest in bottling infrastructure, grant them territorial rights to provide the secret concentrate they'll mix with local water and sugar, maintain strict quality control. The system succeeds because it requires minimal capital investment from Coca-Cola itself, while creating powerful incentives for bottlers to expand their territories. Each bottler becomes a stakeholder in the brand's success, a missionary spreading Coca-Cola through their communities. Germany represents a particularly promising market. The country boasts sophisticated infrastructure, a large middle class, and a culture that appreciates carbonated mineral waters. German consumers readily adopt novel beverages when marketed effectively. Coca-Cola Deutschland establishes headquarters in Essen in 1929, just as the global economy enters crisis. The timing proves both unfortunate and paradoxically advantageous. The Great Depression devastates global trade, but it also creates opportunities for companies offering small, affordable pleasures during hardship. Coca-Cola positions itself as an accessible luxury, a few pfennigs for a moment of sweetness when life offers little else to celebrate. German sales grow steadily throughout the early 1930s, even as unemployment reaches devastating levels. Managing this expansion requires a particular kind of executive, someone who understands both American corporate culture and German business practices, someone fluent in two very different worlds. The man Coca-Cola selects for this role arrives in Germany in 1933, the same year Adolf Hitler becomes Chancellor. His name is Max Keith. Born in Germany, educated in business, Keith represents the ideal candidate for managing Coca-Cola's German operations during a period of explosive growth. He speaks perfect German and adequate English. He understands German bureaucracy and American efficiency. He's ambitious, competent, and apolitical. His loyalty extends to the company, not to ideology. Keith assumes control of Coca-Cola Deutschland just as profound changes sweep through German society. The Nazi regime implements policies transforming every aspect of German life, and American corporations operating in Germany face difficult questions about how to navigate this new reality. Do they withdraw entirely, abandoning profitable operations and German employees? Do they attempt to maintain operations while somehow remaining separate from the regime? Do they adapt to the new political reality, accepting that doing business in Germany now requires accommodation with Nazi policies? Coca-Cola chooses adaptation. This isn't unique. Virtually every American company operating in Germany during the 1930s makes similar calculations. International Business Machines provides punch card systems that help organize Nazi census data. Ford and General Motors supply trucks and vehicles to German military forces. Standard Oil maintains petroleum agreements. These companies reason that business exists separately from politics, that selling products to German consumers doesn't constitute endorsement of Nazi policies, that corporate operations can remain morally neutral even within authoritarian systems. Keith embraces this reasoning enthusiastically. Under his management, Coca-Cola Deutschland expands aggressively throughout the 1930s. He increases the bottling network from a dozen facilities to more than 40. He establishes distribution relationships with German retailers, restaurants, and cafes. He advertises heavily, associating Coca-Cola with German leisure activities, sports events, and cultural gatherings. Some of this advertising now appears deeply uncomfortable in retrospect. Coca-Cola sponsors the 1936 Berlin Olympics, the massive propaganda showcase where Hitler attempts to demonstrate Aryan athletic superiority. Coca-Cola advertisements appear throughout the Olympic venues. Athletes drink Coca-Cola. The brand associates itself with the Reich's carefully orchestrated spectacle of power. Keith sees this as brilliant marketing, placing Coca-Cola at the center of global attention. The uncomfortable political context seems, to him, irrelevant to the business objective. The sponsorship succeeds spectacularly from a sales perspective. German Coca-Cola consumption increases dramatically following the Olympics. The brand becomes firmly established in German popular culture, no longer viewed as a foreign American novelty, but as an integrated part of German daily life. As Nazi policies grow more aggressive racial laws, persecution of Jews, and militarization, Keith continues expanding Coca-Cola operations without apparent hesitation. When Jewish-owned businesses face forced closures and asset seizures, Coca-Cola Deutschland maintains relationships with suppliers who acquire these assets under duress. When the regime implements labor conscription, Coca-Cola facilities employ workers assigned through government programs. When war production receives priority, Keith negotiates to ensure Coca-Cola's sugar and carbon dioxide allocations continue. This accommodation proves profitable. Between 1933 and 1939, Coca-Cola sales in Germany increased by more than 500%. The number of German citizens employed by Coca-Cola operations grows from hundreds to thousands. Keith becomes one of the most successful executives in the entire Coca-Cola system, praised by Atlanta headquarters for his extraordinary growth numbers. The moral calculation underlying this success goes largely unexamined. Keith operates within a framework common to international business during this era. Corporations exist to generate profit for shareholders. Political systems represent external conditions to navigate, rather than moral judgments to make. and maintaining operations in difficult markets demonstrates business acumen rather than ethical failure. By 1939, when Germany invades Poland and World War II begins, Coca-Cola Deutschland has become deeply embedded in the Nazi economy. The company sources ingredients from suppliers who use forced labor. It employs workers conscripted through Reich programs. It pays taxes that fund military expansion. It operates within regulations designed by a government orchestrating genocide. Keith navigates these realities with apparent skill, maintaining production levels even as war disrupts normal commerce. For 2 years after the war begins, Coca-Cola Deutschland continues operating relatively normally. The company supplies drinks to German military forces. It maintains distribution to civilian markets. It adjusts to wartime rationing but doesn't face existential crisis. Then comes December 1941, and everything changes. Japan attacks Pearl Harbor. The United States enters World War II. Within days, America and Germany formally declare themselves enemies. For Coca-Cola Deutschland, this declaration has immediate, devastating consequences. Communication with Atlanta headquarters ceases completely. Financial transfers become impossible. Most critically, the supply of Coca-Cola concentrate the secret formula, manufactured exclusively in the United States, and shipped to international bottlers stops entirely. Keith finds himself commanding a massive operation that can no longer produce its only product. The bottling facilities remain intact. The distribution network functions. The workforce stands ready. But without concentrate, Coca-Cola Deutschland cannot manufacture Coca-Cola. The company faces extinction within months as existing concentrate supplies deplete. Keith confronts several options, none appealing. He could close operations entirely, mothball the facilities, lay off thousands of German workers, and wait for the war to end, assuming Germany loses and American ownership can be restored. This preserves Coca-Cola's assets but guarantees the Nazi government will seize them for war production, likely within weeks. It also means abandoning employees to unemployment or military conscription. He could attempt to flee Germany, making his way to neutral territory, perhaps Switzerland, and wait out the war safely removed from Nazi authority. This abandons the company entirely, and probably results in his execution if caught fleeing is viewed as treason by the regime, particularly for someone commanding substantial industrial resources. Or he could improvise something unprecedented, use the Coca-Cola facilities to manufacture a different beverage, maintain operations throughout the war, preserve the company's assets and workforce, and hope that when the war ends, Coca-Cola will reclaim its German subsidiary intact rather than destroyed. Keith chooses the third path. It's the choice of a corporate manager committed to organizational survival, willing to navigate any political system that allows him to keep operating. It's also, though he cannot fully perceive this in December 1941, a choice that will tie Coca-Cola's German operations and the beverage he's about to create inextricably to the machinery of Nazi genocide. Standing in his Essen office in the final weeks of 1941, Max Keith begins sketching ideas for a new drink that will later bear a name he cannot yet imagine: Fanta. The severance happens swiftly, brutally, completely. On December 7th, 1941, Japanese aircraft strike Pearl Harbor. On December 8th, the United States declares war on Japan. On December 11th, Germany declares war on the United States. By December 15th, every communication channel between Atlanta and Essen goes dark. For most American corporations operating in Germany, this severance means immediate collapse. Companies without local manufacturing capability simply cease operations. Their German offices close, their executives flee or face internment, their assets fall under Nazi government control as enemy property. But Coca-Cola Deutschland occupies unusual territory. Keith commands 43 bottling facilities, a distribution network reaching every corner of Germany, warehouses full of bottles and machinery, and thousands of German employees whose livelihoods depend on continued operation. The Nazi government views this infrastructure with interest. German economic planners recognize value in Keith's network, not for producing soft drinks, which seem frivolous during total war, but for converting these facilities to war production. Bottling plants can manufacture other liquids, distribution trucks can move military supplies, glass factories can shift to weapons components. The Reich makes Keith an offer: voluntarily convert Coca-Cola facilities to war materials production, maintain your position as manager, or face forcible seizure with far less favorable terms. Keith refuses. His reasoning combines corporate loyalty with self-preservation instinct. If he surrenders the facilities to military production, Coca-Cola's German assets become permanently lost after the war. Assuming Germany loses, the victorious Allies will classify war production facilities as legitimate targets for reparations and dismantling. But if Keith can maintain beverage production, even producing something other than Coca-Cola, perhaps the facilities survive as commercial rather than military infrastructure. Perhaps when the war ends, Coca-Cola Deutschland still exists. This calculation requires extraordinary confidence. Confidence that Germany will lose the war, that Allied victory will eventually come, that Coca-Cola will want to reclaim its German operations, and that Keith's wartime improvisations will be viewed as preservation rather than opportunism or collaboration. In December 1941, with German armies controlling most of Europe and pushing deep into Soviet territory, such confidence appears wildly optimistic. The smart money bets on German victory, or at least a negotiated peace, leaving Nazi control over continental Europe intact. But Keith commits to his course. He informs Reich economic planners that Coca-Cola Deutschland will continue beverage production, that the facilities serve German civilian morale better as sources of refreshment than as additional war plants among thousands already operating, that maintaining some normalcy in civilian life strengthens rather than weakens the war effort. He frames continued beverage production as supporting Nazi goals rather than resisting them. The argument succeeds, partly because it contains truth. Totalitarian regimes understand that populations need small reliefs from constant sacrifice, and partly because Keith has built relationships with Nazi bureaucrats over 8 years of operations. He's proven himself a competent manager who delivers production quotas, employs German workers, and pays taxes reliably. The regime grants him permission to continue operating, with conditions. He must source all ingredients. Domestically, accept whatever rationing the war economy imposes, employ workers assigned through government labor programs, and meet production targets demonstrating value to civilian morale. Keith accepts these conditions knowing they're nearly impossible to fulfill. Coca-Cola's formula requires specific ingredients: coca leaf extract, cola nut extract, citrus oils, vanilla, sugar, phosphoric acid, caffeine. Some of these ingredients simply don't exist within German borders. Others face severe wartime restrictions. Coca-Cola, without Coca-Cola concentrate, isn't Coca-Cola at all. But Keith needs time more than he needs Coca-Cola. Time for the war to progress, for circumstances to change, for opportunities to emerge. Committing to continued beverage production, even knowing the product won't be Coca-Cola, buys him the months he desperately needs. By January 1942, Keith faces his crisis in stark detail. The final supplies of Coca-Cola concentrate will deplete within weeks. Without concentrate, production stops. Without production, the entire enterprise justification collapses. He needs a new beverage, created from whatever ingredients the Nazi war economy makes available, produced quickly enough to maintain continuous operation, and appealing enough that German consumers will actually buy it. Keith assembles his top employees, chemists, production managers, marketing staff. The meeting feels surreal, almost absurd. These men have spent years perfecting Coca-Cola production, ensuring every bottle matches Atlanta's exacting standards. Now Keith asks them to invent something completely different, using whatever scraps wartime Germany provides. The constraints are staggering. Sugar faces strict rationing. Keith can obtain some, but nowhere near Coca-Cola quantities. Imported ingredients are completely unavailable: no vanilla, no citrus oils, no exotic spices. Caffeine supplies are diverted to military use, designated as performance-enhancing stimulant for soldiers. Even carbon dioxide, essential for carbonation, faces allocation limits as industrial production shifts to weapons manufacturing. What remains? What ingredients can Keith access in sufficient quantity to manufacture beverages at commercial scale? The answer reveals the desperation underlying the entire project: industrial waste byproducts from other manufacturing processes. Germany's food production system, reorganized for total war efficiency, generates enormous quantities of waste. Cheese manufacturing produces whey, a liquid byproduct that normally feeds livestock or gets discarded. Apple cider production creates pomace, the pulp remaining after juice extraction, usually composted or burned. Sugar refineries create molasses, a thick syrup with minimal commercial value in wartime when refined sugar itself faces rationing. These waste streams flow constantly through German industry, looking for any productive use. Keith realizes these waste products could become beverage ingredients. Whey provides liquid base and slight sweetness. Apple pomace, properly processed, contributes flavor and natural sugars. Molasses adds sweetness and color. The mixture sounds unappetizing. Described that way, a drink made from cheese waste, apple scraps, and sugar refinery byproducts. But Keith's chemists believe they can process these materials into something drinkable. The technical challenges are formidable. Whey carries a distinctive sour taste that must be masked. Apple pomace contains fiber and pulp that must be filtered to achieve clear liquid. Molasses brings overwhelming heaviness that must be lightened. The chemists experiment with ratios, processing techniques, and whatever minor ingredients remain accessible. Small amounts of citric acid for tartness, beetroot extract for color adjustment, trace minerals for flavor complexity. After weeks of experimentation, they produce something that barely qualifies as success: a slightly cloudy, amber-colored beverage with vague fruity taste, notable sweetness, and peculiar aftertaste that no amount of formulation adjustment eliminates completely. It doesn't taste like Coca-Cola. It doesn't taste particularly good by any objective standard, but it's drinkable, it's carbonated, it's sweet, and most importantly, it can be manufactured using ingredients Keith can actually obtain. Now Keith faces the naming challenge. The product needs a name that sounds appealing, that Germans will accept, that won't immediately reveal its desperate origins. His marketing team brainstorms frantically. They need something that evokes refreshment, pleasure, escape from wartime hardship. A name suggesting the beverage offers something beyond mere survival, even if that's largely illusion. Someone suggests fantasy in German. The name captures exactly what Keith wants to sell: a small fantasy of normalcy, a brief escape into pleasure, a moment of imagined abundance in a landscape of scarcity. The beverage itself can't deliver true quality, but the name promises something better than reality currently offers. The word is too long, someone else notes. Fantasy has 4 syllables, difficult to say quickly, hard to shout across a crowded room ordering a drink. German consumers prefer shorter, punchier brand names. Could they shorten it somehow? Another employee suggests simply cutting the word down: Fanta. Just 2 syllables, easy to say, maintains the fantasy association without being explicit about it. The name sounds cheerful, almost playful, exactly the tone Keith wants to project. Nothing about Fanta suggests wartime desperation or industrial waste ingredients. It sounds like fun, like refreshment, like a normal beverage created by normal company under normal circumstances. Keith approves the name immediately. Fanta it is. Production begins in March 1942. The first bottles roll off assembly lines in Essen, filled with cloudy amber liquid that represents equal parts ingenuity and desperation. Keith prices Fanta slightly below Coca-Cola's pre-war cost, making it accessible to working-class Germans while still generating profit margins that keep the company viable. He distributes samples to retailers throughout the network, asking them to give Fanta prominent placement, to present it as the exciting new product from Coca-Cola Deutschland, rather than as a substitution for something better. Initial consumer response proves lukewarm. Germans accustomed to Coca-Cola's distinctive taste find Fanta disappointingly different, sweeter, stranger, lacking the complexity they expect. The peculiar aftertaste disturbs some drinkers. The cloudy appearance suggests poor quality. Early sales numbers indicate possible failure, but circumstances favor Fanta in ways that pure quality never could. By mid-1942, Germany's civilian population faces increasingly severe shortages. Fresh fruit becomes rare luxury. Genuine sugar virtually disappears from household access. Any sweet beverage, regardless of taste, becomes desirable simply because sweetness itself grows scarce. Fanta offers affordable sweetness when little else does. Moreover, Keith's distribution network ensures Fanta reaches German consumers everywhere. Even as transportation deteriorates under Allied bombing, Coca-Cola Deutschland's trucks continue delivering beverages to remote villages, small-town shops, urban restaurants. Fanta becomes ubiquitous through sheer distribution, efficiency, and ubiquity creates its own form of acceptance. When Fanta is the only carbonated sweet drink available, consumer standards adjust accordingly. Sales begin climbing by summer 1942. Not to Coca-Cola's pre-war levels, wartime economy prevents that, but enough to justify continued production, to keep facilities running, to employ the workforce. Keith meets his production quotas. The Nazi bureaucrats overseeing civilian industry note that Coca-Cola Deutschland contributes to morale maintenance without consuming resources needed for military priorities. The arrangement works, at least superficially. But beneath this surface stability, darker currents flow. Every ingredient entering Fanta production connects to wartime economy systems that extend into occupation, exploitation, and ultimately genocide. The whey comes from cheese factories that seize Jewish-owned dairy operations. The apple pomace originates from orchards worked by forced laborers from occupied territories. The sugar beets grow in fields where Polish prisoners work under armed guard. The very bottles containing Fanta emerge from glass factories employing concentration camp labor. Keith knows some of this. He must know procurement managers report supply chain sources, invoices document ingredient origins, factory inspections reveal labor conditions. The degree of his knowledge remains historically uncertain, but some awareness seems unavoidable for anyone managing industrial operations in Nazi Germany during total war. What remains clear? Keith makes no effort to avoid these supply chains, no attempt to source ingredients from producers not employing forced labor, no negotiation for prison labor-free glass bottles. Such attempts would be futile anyway by 1942. Virtually every industrial process in German-controlled territory involves coercion at some level. The entire economy runs on forced labor, confiscated property, and systematic exploitation of occupied populations. Keith's calculation appears coldly practical. Maintaining Coca-Cola Deutschland requires producing Fanta. Producing Fanta requires ingredients. Ingredients come from wherever the Nazi economy provides them. Investigating supply chain ethics would accomplish nothing except potentially drawing attention to his operations, attention that might threaten the entire survival strategy. The moral weight of these decisions doesn't appear in company records. Keith's letters to trusted colleagues, his private papers, his internal memos, none reveal significant ethical struggle. He writes about production quotas, ingredient shortages, distribution challenges, sales figures. He solves problems with technical efficiency, treating wartime constraints as management challenges rather than moral dilemmas. Perhaps this compartmentalization represents psychological necessity. Perhaps fully acknowledging his beverage's connections to Nazi atrocities would make continued operation psychologically unbearable. Perhaps Keith genuinely believes that keeping Coca-Cola facilities running serves greater good, preserving assets for eventual American reclamation, protecting German employees from worse fates, maintaining some fragment of commercial normalcy. Or perhaps he simply doesn't think about it much. Wartime operations demand constant crisis management. There's always another shortage to navigate, another production problem to solve, another bureaucratic requirement to fulfill. Ethical contemplation becomes luxury that operational necessities don't permit. Whatever his internal state, Keith's external behavior remains consistent. He produces Fanta using whatever ingredients the Nazi war economy provides. He employs workers assigned through Reich labor programs. He meets production targets that keep bureaucrats satisfied. And he carefully documents every transaction with meticulous financial records that he hopes will eventually prove his loyalty to Coca-Cola rather than to the Reich. By late 1942, Fanta production reaches stable rhythm. The formula continues evolving as ingredient availability shifts: more apple pomace when whey grows scarce, more molasses when apples become unavailable. Constant adjustment to maintain consistency despite supply chaos. Consumers grow accustomed to these variations, accepting that wartime circumstances prevent perfect standardization. Keith expands production cautiously, opening Fanta lines in additional bottling facilities, increasing distribution reach, building what he hopes will be sustainable operation throughout however long the war continues. He needs Fanta to succeed not spectacularly but adequately enough to justify continued operations, not enough to attract excessive government attention. The balancing act grows more precarious as the war intensifies. Allied bombing raids begin targeting German industrial infrastructure. Several Coca-Cola facilities suffer damage, requiring repairs with increasingly scarce materials. Transportation networks deteriorate, making distribution more difficult. Ingredient supplies become less reliable as agricultural production struggles under labor shortages and bombing disruption. Yet Keith persists. Through 1943 and 1944, Fanta production continues. The beverage becomes established part of German wartime life, not beloved, not particularly missed if unavailable, but present and familiar and occasionally pleasant. German soldiers receive Fanta rations. Factory workers drink Fanta during breaks. Children taste Fanta as rare treat when parents can afford small luxuries. And every bottle sold generates revenue that Keith carefully segregates into separate accounts, preparing for the day when American forces arrive, and Atlanta headquarters demands accounting of what happened to Coca-Cola Deutschland during the years when communications ceased and the war raged across Europe. That accounting approaches sooner than Keith might expect. Innovation emerges from necessity more often than from inspiration. History remembers breakthrough inventions as moments of genius, brilliant minds solving elegant problems through pure intellectual force. The reality proves messier, more desperate. True innovation often happens when circumstances eliminate every comfortable option, when survival requires creating something from nothing, when constraint becomes the only available resource. Fanta's creation exemplifies this uncomfortable truth. Nothing about its development suggests genius. No brilliant chemist suddenly perceives the perfect formula. No marketing visionary crafts compelling brand identity. Instead, a corporate manager facing imminent collapse improvises a beverage from industrial waste because the alternative means losing everything he's built. The technical challenge Keith's chemists face borders on impossible. They must create a drinkable carbonated beverage using only ingredients available in wartime Germany, ingredients that exist in sufficient quantity for commercial production, that cost little enough to generate profit at affordable prices, and that somehow combine into something consumers will voluntarily purchase. Start with the base liquid. Normal soft drink production begins with purified water mixed with concentrated flavoring syrup. Keith's chemists lack the concentrated syrups that define commercial beverages. They need liquid that already possesses some flavor, some sweetness, some character that can form foundation for a drink. Whey provides unexpected answer. The liquid byproduct of cheese manufacturing, whey contains lactose milk sugar that contributes sweetness without requiring precious rationed cane sugar. German cheese production continues throughout the war at reduced but significant levels, generating steady whey supply that normally feeds livestock or flows down drains. Whey costs almost nothing because it's waste, abundant because cheese production never stops, and available because few other industries want it. But whey presents formidable problems. In its natural state, whey tastes distinctly sour, carrying sharp acidic notes that overpower any sweetness. It also contains proteins and fats that create cloudy appearance and unpleasant mouthfeel. Using whey as beverage base requires extensive processing, heating to denature proteins, filtering to remove fats, chemical treatment to neutralize acidity. Keith's chemists develop multi-stage processing system. They heat whey to 90 degrees Celsius, causing proteins to coagulate into removable solids. They filter the resulting liquid through increasingly fine screens, extracting particles until the whey runs relatively clear. They add small amounts of calcium hydroxide lime to reduce acidity, bringing pH closer to neutral. The processed whey emerges less offensive than raw whey, though still carrying distinctive taste that must be masked. For flavor masking and additional sweetness, the chemists turn to apple pomace. Germany produces enormous quantities of apples, even during wartime, and much of this production becomes cider. The cider-making process extracts juice from crushed apples, leaving behind pomace fibrous pulp containing residual sugars, trace apple oils, and pectin. Normally this pomace feeds pigs or enriches compost heaps. Keith's team discovers that boiling pomace in water extracts remaining sugars and apple essence, creating a concentrated liquid with genuine fruit character. The extraction process requires careful temperature control. Too hot, and bitter compounds from seeds and stems contaminate the liquid. Too cool, and insufficient flavor transfers. Through experimentation, they establish optimal extraction temperature of 85 degrees Celsius maintained for 45 minutes. The resulting apple extract provides fruitiness that helps disguise whey's peculiar background taste. It also contributes natural sugars that supplement the whey's lactose, building sweetness toward acceptable levels without requiring excessive refined sugar. But sweetness still falls short. Even combining whey's lactose and apple extract's fructose, the mixture lacks sufficient sweetness to satisfy consumers expecting soft drink sugar levels. Keith needs additional sweetener, something available despite wartime rationing, something affordable enough for commercial production. Molasses becomes the solution. Sugar refineries produce molasses as byproduct when processing sugar beets or sugar cane. The thick, dark syrup contains concentrated sugars that crystallization couldn't extract, along with minerals and compounds that give molasses its characteristic strong flavor. In peacetime, molasses feeds livestock or ferments into industrial alcohol. In wartime, with refined sugar strictly rationed, molasses represents accessible sweetness. Keith negotiates contracts with sugar refineries throughout German-controlled territory, purchasing molasses at minimal cost because it's industrial waste. The molasses provides powerful sweetness, so powerful that it threatens to overwhelm the apple and whey flavors entirely. The chemists carefully calibrate ratios, seeking balance where molasses contributes sufficient sugar without dominating taste profile. The formula gradually emerges through hundreds of experimental batches: processed whey as base, apple pomace extract for fruit character, molasses for sweetness, citric acid to add tartness and brighten flavors. Small amounts of beetroot extract to adjust color from sickly gray toward more appealing amber. The proportions shift constantly as ingredient availability fluctuates, sometimes more whey, sometimes more apple, always adjusting to maintain drinkability despite supply chaos. Carbonation presents separate challenge. Coca-Cola's signature effervescence comes from carbon dioxide forced under pressure into liquid, creating dissolved gas that releases as bubbles when pressure releases. The process requires substantial carbon dioxide supply and specialized equipment maintaining high pressure during bottling. Germany's carbon dioxide production faces wartime redirection. Chemical plants that once supplied beverage industry now prioritize carbon dioxide for welding, fire suppression, and other military applications. Keith secures allocation for Fanta carbonation, but at reduced levels compared to Coca-Cola's pre-war supply. The resulting beverage carries lighter carbonation than Coca-Cola possessed. Pleasant enough but less aggressively fizzy, more gentle on the palate. Actually, this lighter carbonation proves somewhat advantageous. The whey apple molasses mixture's complex flavors benefit from restrained effervescence that doesn't overwhelm taste buds. Heavily carbonated beverages create tingling sensation that can mask subtle flavors. Fanta's gentler carbonation allows its fruit and sweetness to register more clearly. Bottle supply creates ongoing struggle. Glass manufacturing requires substantial energy furnaces, operating at temperatures exceeding 1,400 degrees Celsius. Wartime energy rationing restricts glass production severely. Additionally, Allied bombing campaigns specifically target glass factories as dual-use facilities that might supply military optics or vehicle windows. Keith maintains relationships with multiple glass suppliers, diversifying risk. When one factory suffers bombing damage, others continue providing bottles. He also initiates bottle return programs, offering small refunds to consumers who return empty Fanta bottles for reuse. The program serves dual purpose, conserving scarce glass and creating customer engagement that encourages repeat purchases. The returned bottles require careful inspection and cleaning. Glass weakens through repeated use, developing microscopic cracks that eventually cause shattering. Keith's quality control staff learn to identify compromised bottles, removing them from circulation before they fail during filling or storage. The rejected bottles go to glass recyclers who melt them for new bottle production, closing the loop as completely as wartime conditions allow. Marketing Fanta requires delicate balance. Keith needs Germans to embrace Fanta enthusiastically enough to generate sales, but not so enthusiastically that the beverage attracts excessive government attention. Too much success might trigger Reich bureaucrats to wonder if Fanta's ingredients could serve military purposes, or if Keith's facilities should convert to producing something more directly supporting war efforts. The advertising campaigns Keith approves emphasize modest pleasures. Fanta advertisements show German workers enjoying brief refreshment during factory breaks, families sharing Fanta at simple meals, children receiving Fanta as occasional treats. The messaging carefully avoids suggesting abundance or luxury, nothing that might seem inappropriate during wartime sacrifice. Instead, Fanta positions itself as small reward for hard work, affordable brightness in grey daily routine. The advertisements never mention Coca-Cola. Keith deliberately separates Fanta's identity from Coca-Cola's brand, presenting Fanta as independent product created specifically for German tastes during this particular moment. This strategy serves multiple purposes. It avoids reminding Germans that Coca-Cola Deutschland is American-owned enemy property. It protects the Coca-Cola brand from association with wartime compromises, and it establishes Fanta as genuinely German product rather than inferior substitute. Consumer response evolves gradually. Early adopters in spring 1942 find Fanta strange, disappointing compared to remembered Coca-Cola. But as months pass and war intensifies, consumer expectations adjust. By late 1942, many Germans no longer clearly remember Coca-Cola's taste. Fanta becomes the reference point, the normal beverage against which nothing compares because nothing else exists. Children who first taste Fanta in 1942 or later have no Coca-Cola memories at all. For them, Fanta isn't substitute or compromise. It's simply what soda tastes like. This generational shift proves crucial to Fanta's acceptance. Older Germans might forever consider Fanta inferior to vanished Coca-Cola, but younger Germans grow up with Fanta as their soft drink baseline. Production volume climbs steadily through 1943. Keith adds Fanta production lines in bottling facilities previously devoted exclusively to Coca-Cola. He trains workers in the modified processes required for Fanta's more complex manufacturing, the whey processing, the apple extraction, the precise carbonation. The workforce adapts, developing expertise in this new beverage that keeps them employed when so many other civilian industries face closure. By mid-1943, Fanta production reaches approximately 3 million bottles monthly across all Coca-Cola Deutschland facilities. This represents roughly 40% of Coca-Cola's peak pre-war German production, significant commercial success under wartime constraints. Though nowhere near the volumes Coca-Cola achieved during peacetime abundance, Keith carefully tracks every pfennig. His accounting systems document ingredient purchases, production costs, distribution expenses, and sales revenue with obsessive precision. He segregates Fanta profits into separate accounts, maintaining clear distinction between operational funds needed for continued business and surplus revenue that theoretically belongs to Coca-Cola headquarters in Atlanta, currently unreachable beyond enemy lines. This financial segregation reflects Keith's long-term strategy. He operates under assumption that Germany will lose the war, that Allied forces will eventually occupy German territory, that Coca-Cola will seek to reclaim its German subsidiary. When that moment arrives, Keith needs documentation, proving his loyalty to the company rather than the Reich, proof that he preserved Coca-Cola's assets despite impossible circumstances, evidence that Fanta's profits belong to Coca-Cola rather than having been diverted to personal enrichment or Nazi coffers. Whether this strategy represents genuine corporate loyalty or sophisticated self-preservation remains ambiguous. Keith certainly benefits personally from his no. He continued operations, maintaining his salary, his status, his relevance, but he also exposes himself to significant risk. If Germany wins the war, his careful preservation of American corporate assets might be viewed as treasonous failure to fully support Reich war efforts. If Germany loses but Keith's documentation fails to convince Allied authorities of his loyalty, he faces prosecution as collaborator. Keith gambles everything on a specific outcome: German defeat, followed by American willingness to forgive wartime compromises in exchange for intact company assets. It's remarkably optimistic calculation for someone operating in 1943 Germany, when Nazi control still extends from Atlantic to deep inside Soviet territory, when German defeat remains far from certain, yet Keith persists in his strategy. Through 1944, as Allied bombing intensifies and Germany's strategic situation deteriorates, Keith continues producing Fanta, continues segregating profits, continues documenting every transaction with meticulous care. Several Coca-Cola facilities suffer bomb damage. He repairs them when possible, shifts production to undamaged facilities when repairs prove impossible. The formula continues evolving. Ingredient availability grows increasingly erratic as Germany's agricultural production collapses under labor shortages and transportation breakdowns. Some months bring abundant apple pomace, other months barely any. Keith's chemists adjust constantly, maintaining drinkability despite wild ingredient fluctuations. Consumers notice these variations. Fanta tastes slightly different batch to batch, sometimes sweeter, sometimes more tart, sometimes more dilute. But consistency becomes luxury that wartime simply doesn't permit. By early 1945, Fanta production becomes increasingly difficult. Allied armies advance from east and west. Germany's infrastructure fragments under bombing and ground combat. Supply chains that Keith depends on whey from cheese factories, pommes from apple processors, molasses from sugar refineries break down as facilities close or suffer damage. Transportation between facilities and markets grows unreliable as railways and roads face destruction. Keith continues operating wherever possible, producing Fanta in facilities that still function, distributing to markets that remain accessible. The enterprise fragments into semi-independent operations as communication networks fail. Individual bottling plant managers make local decisions without guidance from Essen headquarters, maintaining production as long as they possess ingredients and functional equipment. And then, in the spring of 1945, the war ends. Allied forces occupy German territory. Keith faces the moment his entire wartime strategy anticipated, accounting for what happened to Coca-Cola Deutschland during 4 years when Atlanta headquarters lost all contact and control. The documentation he preserved so carefully now faces scrutiny. The story he constructed about loyal preservation of American assets confronts investigation, and the American soldiers arriving at Coca-Cola facilities discover something unexpected, something that transforms the narrative Keith carefully prepared. Every bottle of Fanta carries invisible history written in human suffering. The bright liquid, the cheerful carbonation, the sweet taste, these surface qualities mask connections extending through supply chains into the darkest machinery of the 20th century. Understanding Fanta's true wartime story requires following those connections, tracing ingredients backward from bottling plants through procurement networks into the occupied territories, seized properties, and concentration camps that powered Nazi Germany's economy. Start with the whey. Cheese production throughout German-controlled territory expanded during the war years despite overall agricultural decline. The Reich needed cheese for military rations, for feeding industrial workers, for maintaining civilian morale through familiar foods. Meeting these demands required increasing dairy processing capacity, precisely when labor shortages affected every industry. The solution? Forced labor from occupied territories. Polish workers, Soviet prisoners of war, and concentration camp inmates found themselves assigned to cheese factories throughout Germany and occupied regions. These weren't volunteers seeking employment. They were enslaved people working under armed guard, receiving minimal food, enduring brutal conditions, facing execution for minor infractions. Cheese factories employing this forced labor generated the whey that became Fanta's base ingredient. Keith's procurement managers negotiated contracts with these facilities, arranged deliveries, paid invoices. The paperwork treated whey as ordinary industrial byproduct, mentioning nothing about how it was produced or who produced it. But the connection existed, traceable through documents that survived the war. Purchase orders, linking Coca-Cola Deutschland to specific cheese manufacturers, facility inspection reports noting Eastern workers operating production lines, transport manifests, showing whey shipments from plants, later confirmed to have employed concentration camp labor. The apple pommes tells similar story. Apple orchards throughout occupied Poland, France, and Czechoslovakia fell under German control. Some orchards were simply seized from their owners, particularly Jewish families whose property the Reich confiscated under racial laws. Other orchards continued operating under their original owners, but faced forced labor conscription. The Reich assigned prisoners to agricultural work, and orchard owners had no legal authority to refuse. These orchards produced apples that became cider, generating pommes that suppliers sold to Coca-Cola Deutschland. Keith's company purchased this pommes as cheap ingredient source, asking no questions about its origins. The procurement system functioned through layers of intermediaries, wholesale suppliers who aggregated pommes from multiple cider producers, distributors who transported it to bottling facilities, processors who dried and prepared it for use. Each layer created distance between Fanta production and the coerced labor that made that production possible. But distance doesn't eliminate connection. The apples that became Fanta's fruity flavor were picked by people who had no choice, processed in facilities that operated through systematic brutality, transported on railways that also carried victims to extermination camps. The same infrastructure, the same economic system, the same authoritarian control that made Holocaust possible also made Fanta possible. Molasses supply chains prove equally dark. Sugar beet cultivation expanded dramatically in Germany and occupied territories during the war, driven by refined sugar's military importance and rationing's impact on civilian access. Growing and harvesting sugar beets requires intensive manual labor, planting, weeding, harvesting, all demand workers willing to spend long hours performing physically demanding agricultural work. Germany met this labor demand through conscription and coercion. By 1943, virtually every sugar beet field employed forced laborers. Some came from occupied territories under mandatory work programs. Others came directly from concentration camps. Inmates deemed healthy enough for agricultural labor, but not valuable enough for skilled industrial work. These workers received starvation rations, endured exposure to weather extremes, and faced violent punishment for perceived laziness. The sugar beets they harvested became refined sugar for military and elite use, with molasses byproduct entering commercial channels. Coca-Cola Deutschland purchased this molasses from sugar refineries throughout German-controlled territory. Keith's procurement managers evaluated molasses suppliers based on price, quality, and delivery reliability. Whether those suppliers employed forced labor apparently entered no evaluation criteria. Even the bottles themselves connect to concentration camp systems. Glass manufacturing requires intense heat and heavy labor-loading furnaces, manipulating molten glass, operating machinery in temperatures exceeding 40 degrees Celsius. German glass factories increasingly relied on concentration camp labor as the war progressed, particularly inmates considered too weak for more demanding work, but still capable of performing repetitive tasks. Several glass suppliers that provided bottles to Coca-Cola Deutschland employed concentration camp labor. Facility records document these arrangements explicitly. The Reich leased prisoners to private companies, charging fees per worker that companies paid to the SS. These transactions generated official paperwork, labor requisition forms, payment records, productivity reports, tracking how many bottles prisoners produced per shift. Some of these documents survived the war. Historians examining post-war archives discovered contracts between glass manufacturers and concentration camp administration, invoices for prisoner labor, and delivery records showing those manufacturers supplied bottles to Coca-Cola Deutschland. The chain of evidence establishes beyond doubt that concentration camp labor helped produce the bottles that contained Fanta. Keith's degree of knowledge about these supply chain connections remains contested. Did he actively investigate ingredient sources and choose to proceed despite knowing about forced labor? Did he remain deliberately ignorant, avoiding questions whose answers might create legal or moral obligations? Did he genuinely not know, operating within systems so compartmentalized that procurement managers handled supplier relationships without executive oversight? The available evidence suggests awareness, if not complete, knowledge. Corporate correspondence from the period shows Keith discussing labor shortages affecting suppliers, negotiating delivery schedules disrupted by worker allocation changes, bureaucratic language that often meant forced labor reassignments. Internal memos reference Eastern workers at supplier facilities, using the common German euphemism for forced laborers from occupied territories. Production reports note quality variations attributed to inexperienced workforce, which frequently meant newly arrived concentration camp prisoners. These references appear casually, embedded in routine business discussions. They suggest that forced labor's presence throughout German industry was so normalized, so ubiquitous, that corporate managers discussed it matter-of-factly, without particular concern. Keith operated within an economic system where coerced labor powered nearly every production process. Investigating or attempting to avoid such connections would have required extraordinary effort and likely proved impossible by 1943. Finding suppliers who didn't employ forced labor anywhere in their operations meant finding suppliers who didn't exist. This normalization itself reveals something profound about how atrocity functions at industrial scale. The Holocaust wasn't executed exclusively in extermination camps by dedicated murderers. It was also implemented through ordinary business practices by conventional managers making routine procurement decisions. Every invoice paid, every contract signed, every delivery accepted contributed infinitesimally to the machinery of genocide. The contributions were so dispersed, so indirect, so embedded in normal commercial activity that individual participants could rationalize their innocence. Keith likely performed precisely this rationalization. He wasn't killing anyone directly. He wasn't operating concentration camps. He was manufacturing beverages, maintaining employment for thousands of German workers, preserving American corporate assets. That his beverage ingredients connected through multiple intermediaries to forced labor and stolen property that represented unfortunate reality of operating in wartime economy. What else could he do? Shut down entirely? That wouldn't free any prisoners or return any seized property. It would simply destroy Coca-Cola Deutschland while achieving nothing. This logic contains genuine complexity. Keith's alternative choices were genuinely limited. Refusing to purchase ingredients from suppliers employing forced labor meant refusing to purchase ingredients at all, which meant closing operations, which meant losing everything he'd built, and likely facing Reich punishment for abandoning German civilian morale efforts. Operating required participating in systems he didn't create and couldn't change. Yet this complexity doesn't eliminate moral weight. Keith chose to continue producing Fanta knowing at whatever level of explicit awareness versus willful ignorance that doing so required participating in forced labor systems. He prioritized business survival over ethical purity. He accepted that keeping Coca-Cola Deutschland operating meant becoming enmeshed in Nazi economic crimes. The mathematics of complicity defy simple calculation. How much moral responsibility attaches to purchasing whey from a cheese factory that employs 10 concentration camp prisoners among 50 total workers? What if the prisoners represent 80% of workforce? Does it matter whether Keith knew the specific percentage? Does it matter whether he could have sourced whey elsewhere, or whether all available suppliers employed similar labor practices? These questions extend beyond Keith's individual choices. Every German business operating during the war years faced identical dilemmas. Every manager who kept factories running participated in forced labor systems. Every company that survived the war intact did so by accommodating Nazi economic demands. The entire German industrial base became complicit because complicity represented the only path to survival. This doesn't excuse Keith or Coca-Cola Deutschland. It contextualizes their choices within a system designed to make ethical purity impossible, to ensure that participating in civilian economy meant participating in crimes against humanity. The Nazi regime structured wartime economics specifically to distribute guilt widely, to implicate as many people and institutions as possible in its projects, to make resistance economically suicidal. Fanta emerged from this system. Its ingredients originated in seized property, coerced labor, and systematic exploitation. Its production employed workers assigned through Reich labor programs. Its distribution utilized transportation infrastructure that also moved prisoners to camps. Its sale generated tax revenue that funded military operations. Every aspect of Fanta's existence during wartime connected to Nazi crimes, not necessarily directly, not always visibly, but connected nonetheless through the economic networks that structured daily life in German-controlled territory. These connections persist in historical record. even though they remained invisible to consumers. Germans drinking Fanta in 1943 had no way to trace way back to specific cheese factories or molasses to particular sugar beet fields. They saw only a beverage promising small pleasure during difficult times. The machinery of suffering that made that beverage possible remained hidden, obscured by commercial packaging and marketing cheerfulness. This obscurity itself represents profound historical lesson. Atrocity doesn't always announce itself. It often hides in supply chains, in procurement practices, in routine business operations that appear morally neutral on surface but connect through multiple layers to systematic violence. The concentration camp system succeeded partly through this distribution of violence across so many participants that individual responsibility became diffused beyond recognition. Keith survived the war. Fanta survived the war. The people who picked apples under armed guard, who loaded glass furnaces in concentration camps, who processed cheese while starving, many of them didn't survive. Their labor entered Fanta's ingredients, their suffering converted into carbonated sweetness, their deaths facilitated by economic systems that Keith chose to participate in rather than abandon. That choice, that calculation, that acceptance of moral compromise for corporate survival, this represents Fanta's deepest history, the story hidden beneath bright orange packaging and cheerful marketing. It's history most consumers never encounter, history that companies prefer not to discuss, history that raises questions about consumption and complicity that remain uncomfortably relevant decades later. Understanding Fanta requires confronting this history directly, not to condemn everyone who drinks Fanta as somehow complicit in wartime crimes that would be absurd moral arithmetic, but to recognize that products carry histories, that commercial objects connect to human suffering in ways packaging conceals, that the convenience store beverage aisle contains compressed stories of extraordinary moral complexity. Fanta's wartime existence demonstrates how ordinary business operations can become enmeshed in extraordinary evil, how survival instincts override ethical considerations, how systems of violence rely on participation by people who never view themselves as violent. Every bottle produced between 1942 and 1945 contained these connections, these compromises, these choices to continue rather than resist. And then the war ended, leaving Keith to explain what he had done and why. May 1945 brings transformation no one anticipated. American forces advancing through Western Germany encounter Coca-Cola Deutschland, facilities expecting to find ruins. The intelligence briefings prepared them for destroyed infrastructure, looted warehouses, perhaps desperate German managers attempting to hide or destroy evidence of wartime activities. Instead, they discover something extraordinary. The facilities function. Machinery sits clean and maintained. Warehouses contain orderly inventory. Production lines stand ready for operation. And in the administrative offices, Max Keith waits with meticulously organized documentation spanning 4 years of wartime operations. The American officers who first meet Keith approach with suspicion. He managed an American subsidiary throughout the war, while Germany and America fought. The obvious assumption: collaboration, profiteering, perhaps even active support for Nazi war efforts. The facility's intact condition initially reinforces these suspicions. How did Keith keep everything operational unless he cooperated enthusiastically with Reich authorities? Keith presents his case carefully, methodically. He explains the impossible situation he faced in December 1941 when Coca-Cola concentrate supplies ceased. He describes the choice between abandoning operations entirely or improvising a substitute product. He details Fanta's creation from available ingredients, the manufacturing challenges, the distribution throughout German markets. Then he reveals the surprise: the money. Keith opens bank accounts containing millions of Reichsmarks, all the profits from Fanta sales, carefully segregated from operational expenses, preserved throughout the war. He presents financial records documenting every transaction, ingredient purchases, production costs, distribution expenses, sales revenue. Every pfennig accounted for, tracked through 4 years of chaos. "This money belongs to the Coca-Cola company," Keith tells the American officers. "I preserved it for return to Atlanta headquarters." The Americans examine the documentation skeptically. The level of detail seems almost absurd. Purchase orders from 1942, payroll records from 1943, tax payments from 1944. Keith maintained corporate accounting standards throughout the war with precision that most American companies couldn't match during peacetime. Why? The officers want to understand Keith's motivation. If he believed Germany would win the war, preserving American corporate profits makes no sense. If he feared German defeat, why not flee to neutral territory? If he sought personal enrichment, why segregate profits instead of quietly appropriating them? Keith's explanation combines corporate loyalty with calculated self-preservation. He believed Coca-Cola would eventually reclaim its German operations. He wanted proof that he protected company assets rather than exploiting them. He needed documentation, demonstrating his actions served American corporate interests despite serving German civilian needs. The argument proves effective because it arrives with evidence. Keith doesn't just claim loyalty, he demonstrates it through years of financial records. The millions of Reichsmarks, sitting in segregated accounts, validate his story in ways that words alone never could. But suspicion remains. American investigators begin examining Keith's wartime activities more thoroughly. They interview German employees, review supplier contracts, trace ingredient sources. They discover the forced labor connections, the seized property, the concentration camp systems embedded in Fanta's supply chains. Keith faces difficult questions about what he knew and when he knew it. His answers emphasize impossibility of operating in wartime Germany without encountering forced labor, the normalization of these practices throughout German industry, his lack of authority to change supplier labor practices, even if he had investigated them. The investigators find no evidence of particular enthusiasm for Nazi policies, no documentation suggesting Keith sought out forced labor suppliers, no indication he profited personally from these arrangements beyond his standard salary. He appears to have been a corporate manager navigating impossible circumstances, rather than an ideological collaborator actively supporting Nazi crimes. This distinction matters enormously for Coca-Cola's decision-making. If Keith collaborated enthusiastically with the Reich, the company must disavow him and likely face legal consequences for wartime operations. If Keith simply did what survival required, maintaining operations through compromises that virtually every German business made, then perhaps he protected rather than betrayed company interests. Coca-Cola executives in Atlanta receive reports about the German situation with astonishment. They had written off Coca-Cola Deutschland as total loss, assuming the war destroyed facilities and dispersed assets. Instead, they discover intact infrastructure, experienced workforce, functioning distribution network, and most surprisingly, millions in preserved profits. The profits present both opportunity and problem. Converting Reichsmarks to dollars at fair exchange rates would inject significant capital into Coca-Cola's balance sheet. But accepting these profits means accepting that Coca-Cola Deutschland operated throughout the war, that it produced beverages for German civilian consumption during Nazi regime, that its operations connected to forced labor and stolen property. Coca-Cola faces the same calculation Keith faced in December 1941. Accept moral compromise in exchange for business survival, or maintain ethical purity at enormous cost. The executives choose pragmatism. They reclaim Coca-Cola Deutschland, accept the preserved profits, and retain Keith as manager of German operations. This decision reflects post-war economic realities. Germany needs reconstruction. American companies can participate in that reconstruction or abandon the RU. Market to competitors. Coca-Cola Deutschland's intact infrastructure provides enormous advantage over competitors, starting from nothing. Moral hand-wringing about wartime compromises serves no practical purpose and potentially squanders valuable assets. But accepting Fanta itself proves more complicated. The beverage carries obvious associations with Nazi Germany. Its entire existence represents corporate accommodation with fascist regime. Continuing Fanta production after the war means implicitly endorsing Keith's wartime choices, validating the calculation that business survival justifies moral compromise. Atlanta headquarters initially decides to discontinue Fanta completely. The product disappears from German markets by 1949. Coca-Cola Deutschland returns to producing exclusively Coca-Cola, now with concentrate supplies restored from American manufacturing. Fanta seems destined for historical footnote. A wartime curiosity, a desperate improvisation that served its purpose and rightfully vanished when normal operations resumed. But market forces prove stronger than historical discomfort. Through the early 1950s, Coca-Cola executives monitoring European operations notice persistent consumer demand for fruit-flavored carbonated drinks. The Italian market seems particularly receptive. European consumers want alternatives to cola, want citrus flavors, want variety that American-dominated soft drink market hasn't provided. Coca-Cola's product portfolio offers nothing to meet this demand. The company produces Coca-Cola and essentially nothing else. Competitors begin introducing fruit sodas that capture market share Coca-Cola could potentially claim. The executives face commercial opportunity too valuable to ignore. Resurrect Fanta but transformed. 1955. Naples, Italy. Coca-Cola relaunches Fanta as completely new product. The formula bears no resemblance to Keith's wartime mixture. No whey, no apple pomace, no molasses. Instead, Mediterranean orange concentrate provides flavor base. Modern sweeteners replace wartime substitutes. Contemporary preservatives ensure stability. Cheerful packaging projects fun rather than desperation. The only connection to original Fanta, the name. Coca-Cola executives calculate that Fanta carries no obvious Nazi associations to most consumers, that the name sounds pleasantly European without triggering uncomfortable historical memories, that brand recognition matters more than product authenticity. The calculation proves correct. Fanta succeeds immediately in Italian markets. Consumers embrace the orange flavor, the bright carbonation, the positioning as youthful alternative to more serious Coca-Cola. Within 2 years, Fanta expands throughout southern Europe. By the 1960s, it reaches Latin America, Asia, Africa. Each market receives adapted formulas: Mango Fanta in India, Strawberry Fanta in Eastern Europe, Grape Fanta in African nations. The brand becomes vehicle for infinite flavor variations, each tailored to regional preferences, none bearing any resemblance to the original wartime beverage except the name compressed into those 5 letters. This transformation represents historical erasure through commercial success. The new Fanta deliberately severs connections to its origins. Marketing materials emphasize fun, youth, refreshment. Nothing suggests wartime desperation or moral compromise. The bright orange color, the cheerful logo, the playful advertising all construct identity utterly disconnected from Nazi Germany. Most consumers purchasing Fanta in 1960 or 1970 have no idea about wartime origins. They see contemporary soft drink created by reputable American corporation, marketed with professional sophistication. The product they consume shares nothing with Keith's improvised beverage except linguistic coincidence. Even the name's meaning shifts. Fanta no longer suggests fantasy or escape from wartime hardship. It becomes simply a brand name, a collection of sounds that consumers associate with orange soda rather than with any particular etymology or historical reference. Language itself participates in the erasure. By the 1980s, Fanta ranks among Coca-Cola's most successful brands globally. Annual sales reach billions of dollars. The product line extends to dozens of flavors. Marketing campaigns target teenagers and young adults across every continent. Fanta becomes embedded in global popular culture, referenced in music, featured in films, integrated into casual social experiences. This extraordinary commercial success creates strange historical paradox. The beverage born from Nazi-era compromises becomes beloved product, consumed by millions who would find its origins disturbing if they knew them. The name carries forward while the substance transforms completely. The continuity exists purely in corporate branding, not in actual product characteristics. Coca-Cola benefits enormously from this arrangement. Fanta generates massive revenue without carrying obvious historical baggage. The company can celebrate Fanta's success without acknowledging the circumstances of its creation. When questioned about origins, corporate communications emphasize the 1955 Italian relaunch, treating that as Fanta's real beginning, while mentioning wartime creation only reluctantly if at all. Keith himself benefits from similar historical revision. He continues managing Coca-Cola operations in Germany through the 1960s, eventually retiring with full corporate honors. Coca-Cola's official histories portray him as loyal executive who preserved company assets during impossible circumstances, a hero of corporate resourcefulness, rather than a manager who accommodated Nazi systems. Whether Keith deserves heroic status or condemnation remains debated. He undeniably protected Coca-Cola's interests when abandonment seemed inevitable. He maintained employment for thousands during catastrophic war. He documented everything meticulously and returned profits to American ownership. But he also operated facilities supplied by forced labor, participated in Nazi economic systems, prioritized business survival over ethical resistance. The complexity defies simple judgment. Keith made choices that most people in his position would likely make, choices favoring survival and pragmatism over martyrdom and principle. Those choices enabled Coca-Cola Deutschland to emerge from war intact. They also embedded the company in genocidal economy. Fanta's resurrection and global success represent capitalism's extraordinary capacity to separate products from contexts, to transform uncomfortable histories into cheerful brands, to make consumers forget or never learn the origins of things they casually purchase. The transformation from wartime improvisation to global phenomenon required deliberate amnesia, marketing sophistication, and consumer willingness to enjoy products without investigating their pasts. By the 21st century, Fanta sells in nearly every country on Earth. Annual revenue exceeds $3 billion. The brand ranks among most recognized globally, and buried in that success, hidden beneath decades of marketing and product reformulation, lies a history that surfaces only occasionally, never quite breaking through permanently, never fully submerging either. History refuses to stay buried. It surfaces periodically, breaking through decades of commercial success and carefully constructed brand identity, forcing uncomfortable reckonings before subsiding again. Fanta's Nazi origins follow this pattern, emerging into public consciousness through journalistic investigation or corporate acknowledgement, generating brief controversy, then fading as attention shifts elsewhere, only to resurface years later when new generations discover what previous generations forgot or never learned. The first significant revelation arrives in 1993. A German journalist researching Coca-Cola's wartime operations stumbles across archival documents describing Fanta's creation in Nazi Germany. The story seems almost too strange for credibility. One of the world's most popular beverages, consumed casually by millions, originated as improvised substitute created by corporate manager navigating genocidal regime. The journalist publishes findings in prominent German newspaper. The article details Keith's situation in December 1941, the creation of Fanta from industrial waste, the production throughout the war years, the connections to forced labor supply chains. The reporting handles the material carefully, avoiding sensationalism while making the uncomfortable facts clear. Fanta emerged from Nazi economy, operated within systems of coercion and exploitation, generated profits from civilian population during regime's darkest crimes. German media picks up the story. Television programs discuss the revelation. Radio interviews explore the implications. For several weeks, Fanta's origins become topic of national conversation. Some consumers announce boycotts. Others defend their consumption by noting modern Fanta's complete disconnection from wartime formula. Coca-Cola issues carefully worded statement, acknowledging historical facts while emphasizing transformation of the product. Then the controversy fades. Within months, media attention shifts to newer stories. Fanta sales briefly dip but quickly recover. The revelation enters historical record without fundamentally changing consumer behavior. Most people who learn about Fanta's origins continue drinking Fanta, having performed mental calculations that separate present product from past context. This pattern revelation, brief controversy, return to normalcy repeats multiple times over subsequent decades. Each eruption of memory follows similar trajectory. Historical facts surface and generate temporary discomfort, then subside beneath weight of consumer habit and corporate marketing. 2004 brings more substantial exposure. Coca-Cola itself, in calculated moment of corporate transparency, acknowledges Fanta's Nazi-era creation during advertising campaign in Europe. The decision reflects sophisticated reputation management. Rather than waiting for journalists to expose uncomfortable history, the company controls the narrative by acknowledging it directly. The advertisements frame the story as tale of survival rather than collaboration. They emphasize Keith's preservation of assets for eventual return to American control. They note that modern Fanta shares nothing with original formula except name. They position the history as testament to human ingenuity under extreme constraint rather than as example of corporate moral compromise. The framing proves remarkably effective. Media coverage of Coca-Cola's acknowledgement treats the transparency itself as newsworthy. Company admits Nazi origins. Headlines generate attention, while the carefully constructed narrative shapes interpretation. Critics praise Coca-Cola for honesty. The company receives credit for confronting uncomfortable past, even while that confrontation carefully directs how audiences understand the past. But not everyone accepts the framing. Activist groups argue that Coca-Cola's narrative obscures more than it reveals. They point out the forced labor connections barely mentioned in corporate statements. They emphasize Keith's choice to continue operations rather than resist. They question whether survival adequately describes profiting from Nazi economy while millions suffered and died. These critiques gain traction in certain communities but fail to achieve mainstream resonance. Most consumers encounter the story through Coca-Cola's controlled narrative, rather than through critical analysis. The company's version survival tale, emphasizing asset preservation, becomes dominant interpretation. The internet age amplifies these periodic eruptions exponentially. Social media enables rapid information spread and coordinated response in ways traditional media never permitted. When Fanta's Nazi origins resurface online, the revelations reach millions within hours. 2010 brings significant social media campaign. Activists create graphics pairing 1940-era Fanta advertisements with Holocaust photographs. The juxtaposition makes explicit what corporate narratives obscure. Fanta existed simultaneously with genocide, operated within the same economic system, connected through supply chains to the same machinery of death. The images spread virally across platforms. Young people encounter the history for first time, expressing shock that beloved beverage carries such dark origins. Hashtags calling for Fanta boycotts trend briefly. Online petitions demand Coca-Cola discontinue the brand entirely or donate profits to Holocaust education. Coca-Cola responds with a refined version of its 2004 narrative. Official statements acknowledge wartime creation, while emphasizing modern products' complete disconnection from Nazi era. The company announces donations to Holocaust memorial organizations, funding educational programs about corporate responsibility during authoritarian regimes, supporting historical research into wartime commercial operations. These responses effectively diffuse sustained outrage. The donations seem appropriate, the educational funding appears constructive, and the historical research support suggests genuine commitment to understanding rather than obscuring past. Within weeks, the boycott calls fade. Fanta sales continue unaffected. The social media controversy becomes another eruption that surfaces briefly before subsiding. 2015 brings similar cycle. New generation of social media users discovers Fanta's history and expresses outrage that previous campaigns apparently achieved nothing. The graphics and arguments closely resemble 2010's campaign. Same historical facts, same moral reasoning, same calls for boycott. But the repetition itself reveals something significant. These revelations don't accumulate into sustained pressure or lasting change. Each generation discovers the history anew, reacts with genuine shock, mobilizes briefly, then moves on as other issues capture attention. The periodic nature of memory eruptions allows Coca-Cola to weather each storm without fundamentally altering operations or brand strategy. Historians continue excavating deeper details throughout this period. Academic researchers examining Nazi economic records discover specific connections between Coca-Cola facilities and forced labor systems. They document particular cheese factories employing concentration camp prisoners that supplied way to Keith's operations. They identify apple orchards seized from Jewish families whose produce became Fanta ingredients. They trace molasses shipments from sugar refineries employing Soviet prisoners of war. Each discovery adds specificity to the general understanding that Fanta connected to Nazi atrocities. The connections become traceable through documentation rather than remaining abstract associations. Researchers publish findings in academic journals, historical monographs, documentary films. The scholarship establishes beyond doubt that Fanta's wartime production involved forced labor and seized property at multiple points in supply chains. Yet this scholarly consensus barely penetrates popular consciousness. Academic publications reach specialized audiences. Documentaries attract viewers already interested in history. The detailed research remains largely unknown to average Fanta consumers, who encounter the brand exclusively through commercial contexts that carefully avoid historical references. This gap between historical knowledge and consumer awareness reflects broader patterns in how societies process uncomfortable corporate histories. Products exist in eternal present for most consumers. The beverage in hand matters, while its origins remain irrelevant to immediate consumption experience. Historical context becomes specialty knowledge held by small communities of researchers and activists rather than common understanding, and shaping mass behavior. Some corporations face sustained consequences for wartime activities. German industrial firms that built concentration camp infrastructure or manufactured weapons using slave labor spent decades paying reparations, facing lawsuits, accepting perpetual association with Nazi crimes. But consumer product companies often escape similar accountability. The distance between cheerful beverage and genocidal machinery seems large enough that consumers perform mental separation even when historical research proves the connections. Coca-Cola benefits from this consumer psychology. Fanta generates billions in annual revenue while its Nazi origins surface only periodically, never sustainably. The company weathers each controversy through strategic acknowledgement, targeted philanthropy, and patient waiting for attention to shift elsewhere. Meanwhile, alternative narratives emerge defending Fanta's continued existence. Some argue that Keith genuinely preserved American assets, rather than collaborating enthusiastically. They emphasize his meticulous financial documentation, his return of profits to Coca-Cola, his maintenance of infrastructure that could have been destroyed or seized. In this interpretation, Keith becomes hero of corporate loyalty, who navigated impossible circumstances with skill and integrity. Others frame the story as a lesson about survival, requiring moral compromise. They note that virtually every German business operating during wartime faced identical dilemmas: resist and face destruction, or accommodate and survive. Keith's choices mirror thousands of similar calculations by managers throughout German economy. Singling out Fanta for particular condemnation ignores systemic realities that made ethical purity effectively impossible. These defenses contain genuine complexity. Keith did preserve assets. He did face impossible choices. He did operate within systems he didn't create. But these facts don't eliminate moral weight of his decisions. The complexity itself becomes part of the story, neither simple villainy nor clear heroism, but ambiguous territory where survival instincts, corporate loyalty, and moral compromise intertwine. The periodic eruptions of memory serve important function even when they fail to change consumer behavior dramatically. They ensure the history remains accessible, that each generation can encounter it, that the connections between cheerful beverage and dark past never become completely severed. The eruptions prevent total historical amnesia, even if they don't prevent continued consumption. Some activists view continued consumption as itself problematic, a sign of moral failure, evidence that capitalism successfully separates products from contexts, proof that consumer convenience overrides ethical considerations. Others view continued consumption as pragmatically unavoidable. Modern Fanta truly differs from wartime formula. Current Coca-Cola executives bear no responsibility for decisions made 80 years ago, and boycotting products based on historical origins creates impossible standards that no contemporary brand could meet. These competing perspectives remain unresolved. Each memory eruption triggers the same debates. Does consuming Fanta constitute tacit acceptance of Nazi-era compromises? Does Coca-Cola's acknowledgement of history satisfy ethical obligations, or does continued profit from the brand represent ongoing exploitation of that history? Should products carry moral weight based on origins, or should judgment focus exclusively on present-day practices? The questions lack definitive answers because they involve competing values that different people weight differently. Historical consciousness matters to some people more than others. Brand loyalty overrides historical concerns for some consumers but not for others. The capacity to separate product from context varies individually and culturally. Coca-Cola's strategy acknowledges this diversity of response. The company doesn't attempt to convince everyone that Fanta's history is irrelevant. Instead, it provides sufficient acknowledgement to satisfy those who care about transparency, while continuing operations that serve those who prioritize taste, convenience, and brand familiarity over historical considerations. This strategy succeeds commercially while failing morally, or succeeds morally while failing commercially, depending on one's perspective. Fanta remains among the world's top soft drink brands. Sales continue growing in emerging markets. New flavors launch regularly. The business thrives. And periodically, predictably, inevitably, the history surfaces again. A journalist discovers documents in archives. A social media campaign goes viral. A documentary filmmaker examines wartime operations. Each eruption brings temporary attention, brief controversy, renewed debate, then gradual return to normalcy. The pattern itself becomes historically significant, not whether people stop drinking Fanta, but that the question keeps arising, that each generation must reckon with the connection between consumption and complicity, that the buried history refuses to stay buried even when it fails to fundamentally alter behavior. Fanta persists as monument to unresolved tensions. The bright bottles on supermarket shelves contain compressed history that most consumers never encounter. But that history remains available for those who seek it, erupting periodically through journalism, activism, and scholarship, ensuring that amnesia never becomes complete even when it becomes convenient. The next eruption will come. The pattern guarantees it. And when it arrives, the same debates will resurface, the same defenses will appear, the same calls for boycotts will spread and fade. The cycle continues because the underlying questions remain unresolved. How should we judge survival choices made under impossibly constrained circumstances? What responsibility do corporations bear for historical compromises? Can products transform completely while retaining names that carry dark histories? Should consumers care about origins when present reality differs so dramatically? These questions extend far beyond Fanta. They apply to countless contemporary corporations, countless consumer products, countless compromises that companies make when operating in authoritarian systems or exploitative economies. Fanta's story illuminates patterns still unfolding, still demanding responses, still generating the same periodic eruptions of memory that surface without quite resolving anything. Stand in any convenience store, anywhere in the world. The refrigerated shelves display familiar landscape, rows of colourful bottles promising refreshment, sweetness, with escape from ordinary thirst. Orange Fanta sits among them, its packaging radiating cheerfulness designed by marketing professionals who likely never learned the beverage's full history. Reach for that bottle, feel its coolness. Read the cheerful label. Nothing visible suggests the compressed history. It contains the desperate improvisation in Nazi Germany, the forced labour in supply chains, the corporate calculations prioritizing survival over ethics, the decades of historical erasure through commercial success, the periodic eruptions of memory of that surface without fundamentally changing anything. Most people who drink Fanta never learn this history. Among those who do learn it, most continue drinking, having performed calculations that separate present product from past context. This normalization itself becomes philosophically significant. Our capacity to consume, without historical consciousness, to enjoy products whose origins disturb us when examined, represents either pragmatic compartmentalization or moral blindness depending on perspective. Fanta's continued existence poses questions humanity hasn't resolved. The beverage sells billions of dollars annually while simultaneously serving as artifact of corporate compromise with fascism. These two identities coexist uneasily in public consciousness, surfacing periodically without reaching resolution. The questions extend beyond historical judgment into contemporary practice. Right now, corporations navigate identical moral terrain when operating in authoritarian markets. Technology companies in China accept censorship requirements to access 1 billion consumers. Fashion brands source from factories where labor conditions approach coercion. Automotive manufacturers face decisions about operating in countries whose governments commit human rights violations. These modern scenarios echo Keith's 1941 calculation: survive by adapting to harsh systems, or withdraw entirely and lose everything. The difference: Keith's context gets judged through retrospect, through history's verdict on Nazi evil. Contemporary executives make similar calculations in real time, lacking certainty about how future generations will judge Chinese authoritarianism or other repressive regimes. When does accommodation become collaboration? When does business pragmatism become moral failure? These questions lack formulaic answers because they involve competing values that different people weight differently. Keith believed preserving Coca-Cola Deutschland served greater good than abandoning it. Contemporary executives make similar arguments about maintaining operations in difficult markets rather than withdrawing completely. The mathematics of complicity defy simple calculation. If you drink Fanta, knowing its history, does that constitute endorsement of Keith's wartime choices? If you drink Fanta without knowing its history, does ignorance eliminate moral weight? If you boycott Fanta, based on 80-year-old origins, should you also boycott the countless other products connected to historical compromises that remain undiscovered or unacknowledged? These questions proliferate endlessly, without reaching satisfying resolution. Perhaps resolution isn't possible. Perhaps Fanta endures precisely because the questions it raises resist definitive answers, because the tensions it embodies remain active in contemporary commercial practice, because the choice between ethical purity and pragmatic accommodation continues confronting businesses and consumers daily. Fanta serves as $3 billion per year, reminder that products carry histories, that innovation follows no moral law, that survival instincts drive behavior across ethical boundaries, that capitalism adapts to any political system willing to accommodate it, that historical memory proves selective and commercialized, that consumer desire often overrides ethical considerations. The beverage that began as desperate wartime improvisation using industrial waste became global phenomenon through deliberate transformation and strategic amnesia. Its success demonstrates capitalism's extraordinary capacity to separate products from contexts, to make consumers forget or never learn the origins of things they casually purchase. Yet the history persists. It surfaces in journalism, activism, scholarship. It generates periodic controversies that fade without fundamentally altering commercial reality. Each generation discovers anew the uncomfortable facts about cheerful orange soda's origins in Nazi Germany. Each generation debates what this history means and whether it should influence consumption choices. Each generation largely continues drinking Fanta despite the revelations. This persistence, both of the history and of the consumption, reveals something profound about how we live with moral complexity. We don't resolve these tensions. We don't achieve closure. We navigate ambiguity, making imperfect choices based on incomplete information and competing priorities. We compartmentalize when necessary. We forget when convenient. We remember when confronted. We continue living, consuming, participating in systems whose full moral weight remains unclear. Keith died decades ago, honored by Coca-Cola, a successful executive who preserved company assets during impossible circumstances. Whether he deserved those honors or deserved condemnation remains debated among historians, but largely unknown to general public. His legacy exists primarily in the beverage that bears the name he approved, the brand that generates billions annually, the product that millions consume without thinking about the manager who created it or the circumstances that made creation necessary. The story offers no resolution because the forces that shaped it continue operating. Economic pressure still drives corporate decisions. Survival imperatives still override ethical concerns when circumstances become desperate. Moral compromises still get rationalized as necessary adaptations to harsh reality. Historical memory still proves selective, emphasizing comfortable narratives while obscuring uncomfortable connections. We drink Fanta, or we don't. Either choice leaves fundamental questions unanswered. Consuming it doesn't make us complicit in Nazi crimes that would be absurd moral arithmetic spanning 8 decades. But consuming it without knowing its history, or knowing its history and consuming it anyway, reveals something about how we relate to the products we purchase, the corporations we support, the systems we participate in. Perhaps that revelation represents the story's deepest value, not definitive judgment about whether Keith acted heroically or reprehensibly, not clear guidance about whether Fanta should exist or be boycotted, but rather uncomfortable awareness that every product we consume connects through complex chains to human choices, compromises, and consequences that packaging conceals and marketing obscures. Fanta endures as monument to these unresolved tensions, bright reminder that simple surfaces hide complicated histories, cheerful testament to capitalism's capacity for both extraordinary adaptation and systematic amnesia. The bottles on supermarket shelves contain more than carbonated sweetness. They contain compressed stories of desperation, compromise, survival, transformation, and the persistent question of whether any of it matters enough to change what we choose to drink. The answer remains personal, contested, unresolved, as it should be, as it must be. Because the questions Fanta raises don't have answers, they have ongoing negotiations between competing values, continuing debates about historical responsibility, permanent tensions between consumption, convenience, and ethical consciousness. Tomorrow, millions will drink Fanta without thinking about any of this. Tomorrow, some will learn the history and feel briefly troubled before continuing their lives largely unchanged. Tomorrow, activists will share the story again, hoping this time it resonates differently, this time it generates lasting change. And the cycle will continue, erupting periodically without quite resolving, because resolution requires answering questions that resist definitive answers, because the forces that created Fanta 8 decades ago in Nazi Germany continue shaping corporate decisions today, because we remain uncertain how to balance survival against ethics, pragmatism against principle, commercial success against historical responsibility. Fanta persists. The questions persist. The tension persists. And somewhere in that persistence lies the story's deepest truth. Not comfort of resolved judgment, but discomfort of ongoing uncertainty, permanent reminder that the cheerful bottles we casually purchase carry histories worth knowing, even when knowing them changes nothing.